Let's start this out with some introduction. On the left, that's Calm. On the right there, that's Tess. And in the middle, that's me, Sammy. Just three friends jumping into the crystal clear waters of a Florida spring. For it is into these springs that our next journey takes us. Before Disney's big ears, Space Mountain, a water park, before they owned Star Wars, people flocked to Florida for another reason. The Florida Springs inspired awe and wonder into some of Florida's first visitors. The famous early naturalist William Bartram was one of the first from the West to see them. His writings opened the portal for people around the world to come visit the springs. In the years to follow, these springs became international beacons, weekend getaways, sets of movies. Long before Pam Anderson and Baywatch, these were some of the first locations for early swimsuit models. The first underwater photographer of the springs, Bruce Mozart, created stunning images of the crystal clear waters, serving as the first visual advertising that attracted even more visitors. Soon, bathhouses were built up around the springs, and multiple springs became tourist attractions. These places were touted as sacred healing areas, inviting people to come and gain the natural benefits of the springs. Looking at them, it's hard to think that these places are anything but divine. Whether on a tube, scuba tank, canoe, or just a lung full of air, still today their beauty is visited and cherished by many. Indeed, what better relief can a human get than by heading into nature, where one can find peace and solace that rejuvenates, restores, and replenishes the mind, body, and soul. Beyond recreational and spiritual value, these springs provide even more. A glimpse into where water comes from itself. As technology progressed, humans were soon able to enter these caves and caverns, places no one had seen before. In addition to otherworldly beauty, these caverns showed us exactly where our water comes from, deep down in the earth. So how do these places exist? How is it possible that we can swim in our very own drinking water? Throughout Florida, we live on top of our groundwater, a massive, interconnected underground water basin we call an aquifer, the Floridan Aquifer, supplying drinking water to over 10 million people across Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and South Carolina. The unique geology of Florida is made up of limestone, a Swiss cheese-like rock composed of skeletal remains of marine animals compressed over thousands of years. Water from the Floridan Aquifer exists throughout this porous ground, and in North and Central Florida, the pressure of water from the aquifer pushes the water out from the confines of its dark abyss and bubbles through the limestone to the surface, creating glorious, crystal clear pools known as springs. These springs create spring runs that flow into rivers that eventually flow into the seas. And here in North Central Florida, we have the highest concentration of them in the world, with over 1,000 springs, each offering their own unique insights and beauty. Combined, these springs expel an estimated 7 billion gallons of water a day. The water in the aquifer is restored through what we all learned about in grade school, the water cycle. Surface water evaporates, condenses into clouds, and rains down upon the earth, filtering through wetlands and limestone to arrive into the aquifer purified. So, the beautiful cycle has gone on for thousands of years. To create this film, I joined forces with Tessa Skiles, who grew up across the street from the springs, loving and appreciating these places since she can remember, under the influence of her late father, Wes Giles, famed cave diver, photographer, filmmaker, educator, and activist. So our journey began. We would pack up Tessa's Honda Element and head out to all the best places to go. Ginny, Alexander, Itchituckney, Silver Glen. The list goes on, and each venture brought a deeper appreciation for these places. But along our journey, we started to notice some springs looked different than others. Some were less clear, a bit more green. Some had these gnarly clumps of algae floating on the surface of the water, on the sand, or all over the beautiful eelgrass. It became visually obvious to us that some springs are just healthier than others. But why? If we look back at history, we find that it wasn't until development came to Florida that the health of springs started to decline. The lovable climate, tempered by low cost of living, meant that people could actually live in a place where they wanted to. The population of Florida started to skyrocket. And in the last 40 years, Florida's population has more than doubled to over 20 million people, now the third most populous state in the United States of America. When people need to move to an area, they basically clear-cut sections of land, whether it be forest, swamp, or prairie, to live in. And making space for millions of new residents requires a lot of clear-cutting. The first thing installed in areas are water wells, to allow for access to water, which became some of the first culprits to our springs. Before large-scale development, Kissingen Springs was once a popular venue for recreation, until it dried up in 1950 due to hundreds of wells being drilled in the Floridan Aquifer. We wanted to find out more about springs drying up, so Tessa called upon Tom Morse, one of the world's leading cave exploration scientists and a biologist, who recommended we head out to White Springs, one of the next springs to fall after Kissingen. So where are we going, Tom?
To the old bathhouse. Actually, it's a new bathhouse. The old one was falling apart, so they built a new one. This, of course, was a health spa. Started around the turn of the century, and it used to be really, really popular. And they touted the healing wonder waters, right, of the Sulphur Spring. Well, Sulphur Spring is kind of dried up now. There's more water here than I expected. Sometimes it's just a pool right down there. But this was the old bathhouse, what it kind of looked like, and there used to be hundreds of people here. But around, the 90s, the spring got progressively drier and drier until it's basically dried up.
So how did the public react, and how did was this a business or a state park when it was running?
Well, you know, for many years this place was a big time resort. The Indians used to actually come here. It was kind of a place where even the competing tribes would be peaceful with each other. And the white folks got here and they made a resort out of it. And this town used to have a dozen big hotels. I mean, they came from the coast, they came from up north. And so that went on for a long time. It kind of fizzled out in the 60s. And then the spring dried up, 20 years later. And yeah, there's not much of an attraction anymore. This is kind of a poster child of what may be coming to many more springs in Florida.
Wow. I had heard of dead springs, but I did not think that it would be this bad. Like Tom said, when the springs stopped flowing, so did tourism to the area. Looking at the town now, you'd never know about a bustling place with people rushing to stay in hotels. The White Springs Bathhouse stands as a tombstone of what once was, which actually backflows into the aquifer. That is, when the river water is high, it sucks water into the aquifer through the limestone, instead of pumping water out of it. So how exactly does this happen? We went to consult with Dr. Bob Knight, who's dedicated over 30 years of his scientific career to studying springs and working towards their protection. Dr. Knight, thank you so much for making time for us today.
Glad to be here.
So we really wanted to consult with you because we headed to White Springs with Tom Morris, and we discovered the former greatness that it once had is no longer there. It's more or less a dead, deceased spring.
Yes.
It's sad. It's really sad it doesn't flow anymore. But then at the same time, we can go to Ginny and Ichitucknee and Blue Springs and have an incredible day in crystal clear water and be in awe. And the participants and the visitors there feel like everything is fine. So you have this massive, difference there because people aren't visiting White Spring anymore. And so what is the reason that happened? Why are some springs flowing so little or more or less dead while others are still crystal clear and there seems like there's no problem?
Well, it has to do with hydrogeology, and it has to do with the elevation of land in Florida. White Springs is near the center of the state, and so it's at a higher elevation than springs that are closer to the coast. It's quite clear that the major factor affecting spring flow reductions is pumping.
If overpumping water is the culprit of the springs, where is all this water going? Let's take a moment to look back at White Springs. The water wells impaired White Springs. Increased pumping due to two main sources was the cause of its demise. Heavy pumping to fuel Jacksonville to the east, the city with the largest urban sprawl in the United States of America, and a hefty water use permit approved for a phosphate mine just miles from White Springs that required 40 million gallons a day. The overpumping from these two sources was simply more than the spring was pumping out, and so the spring ceased to flow. So it is not just wells for human use that are impairing the springs, but industry. And phosphate mining is just a part of that. North Central Florida is prime territory for raising agriculture and livestock, which uses massive amounts of water. To see the full picture, let's break down the current water usage as of 2017. Though 33% of Florida's water is used for public water supply, 49% is used for irrigation, 14% is used for industrial purposes, and 4% was used for domestic self-supply.
One of our biggest users of water, of groundwater, is the agricultural industry in Florida. They like to say that they're a very big part of our economy. It turns out when you actually look at the numbers for agricultural production in Florida, it's less than 1% of the Florida economy. And tourism is the biggest part of our economy, far and away, 30 or 40%. And yet we're sacrificing half our water to agriculture. And they, of course, not only utilize it, use it up, consume it, they also pollute the hell out of it because of nitrogen fertilizers. So our springs are suffering from both urban development and agricultural development, and to a certain extent industrial development.
Back when we ventured with Tom Morris to White Springs, later in the day he took us to an area where surface water flows into the aquifer, one of the only places in Florida where one can see this happen. Though many of us don't realize it, what we put on our land ends up flowing into our aquifer, just like rainwater. But to see a visual of this happening in Florida is something truly rare and remarkable. So what else do we put on land that is toxic to our drinking water? From fertilizers used in agriculture, golf courses, and urban lawns, to human and animal waste, we end up poisoning our aquifer with tons of nitrate nitrogen, though we don't even know exactly how much. In 2005, 70% of Florida springs tested exceeded the maximum nitrate concentration for springs. The consequences? Significant ecological alterations. And it doesn't always take an expert to notice the effect on springs, most notably the inordinate presence of algae. So today we are here in Ocala National Forest in Silver Glen Springs. Plan to come out here and do a bunch of freediving with some friends, but unfortunately we came out here and just found a lot of this filamentous algae. Check it out. All throughout here. All over here.
None of that brown stuff that's right there was here last time, and we were here just 3-4 months ago, so yeah, I don't know how I think about that.
And this is not what's supposed to normally happen at the spring. So this is Classic example of what happens when we don't take care of our water.
And then there's our drinking water.
Some wells throughout Florida have been measured with nitrate concentrations at 10 times the drinking water standard in the United States and Florida. And it is thought that there are chronic effects of nitrate at even lower concentrations than this limit.
So it is not just the springs we are poisoning, but ourselves. Just as you may feel right now watching this, we were shocked. Who is in charge here? And how are they letting this happen to our springs, our people, and our water?
To explore management of water in Florida, let's take a step back 50 years. Nationwide public support for the environment did not become widespread until the Earth Day demonstrations of 1970.
This planet is threatened with destruction, and we who live in it with death. The heavens reek, the waters below are foul, children die in infancy, and we and the world, which is our home, live on the brink of nuclear annihilation. We are in a crisis of survival.
This is a CBS News special, Earth Day, a question of survival, with CBS News correspondent Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. A unique day in American history is ending, a day set aside for a nationwide outpouring of mankind seeking its own survival. Earth Day, a day dedicated to enlisting all the citizens of a bountiful country in the common cause of saving life from the deadly byproducts of that bounty, the fouled skies, the filthy waters, the littered earth.
That year, the Environmental Protection Agency was created, the National Institute to Manage and Protect Natural Resources. States followed this national leadership, and as Florida had begun to grow rapidly, there was a clear need for better management of Florida's most crucial resource, its water. This was partially due to the fact that coastal cities had started to experience the first instances of saltwater intrusion. This is when water pressure declines in the aquifer in coastal areas. Saltwater from the ocean can then rush into the lower pressure areas, mixing with fresh water and creating an ecological imbalance and drinking water nightmare. Due to how much water we have in Florida, it became obvious that special management was required for this unique state. So in 1972, in what's often called the Year of the Environment, several natural resource bills were passed in Florida, most notably the Water Resources Act. This ultimately set up 5 regional water management districts and established a permit system for allocating water use. It is these agencies then that are charged with managing the groundwater and surface water resources of Florida. The water management districts are the entities that stamp the final okay on applications for water use in the state. 20 years later, in the mid-1990s, it became evident that water use was exceeding the rate at which our aquifer could renew itself, and this became fact to water management districts, scientists, and politicians alike. In 1999, when Jeb Bush was governor, he actually took a ride down the beautiful Ichetucknee River, guided by Jim Stevenson, a famed and dedicated Florida scientist, which resulted in the creation of the Springs Task Force. Composed of state agency officials, scientific experts, and private citizens, this group was charged with recommending strategies for the Florida Springs Initiative to study, protect, and restore the springs. This initiative equated to funding being set up to monitor these precious resources. Government and scientists were aware of a need to clean up our act as our population would only continue to grow, and were working together to tackle this problem. Things were looking up. And then, 10 years later, under a new governor, something strange happened. Experts started to be fired, replaced by people who would report the opposite of what was happening with Florida's water and push data that would allow water management districts to permit more water to be used by businesses. To tell the story best, we reached out to one of these experts, Jim Gross, and sat down with him to find out exactly what went on.
Jim, thanks for sitting down with us.
Yeah.
Just wanted to talk with you with your work in the St. Johns River Water Management District. You worked there for 12 years.
12 years, yeah.
Starting in 2003.
2003, yep, until 2015.
So what happened? Why did you leave?
Why did I leave? Well, they showed me the door to be to be simple about it.
And how did that come to be? How did that event occur?
Oh, well, you know, a lot of people got let go at the districts. Some were let go just for, you know, cutting costs, and another group of people were let go because they were kind of experts that weren't wanted around anymore. And I fell into that latter category of people who knew things that needed to be denied. Firing people because they know too much is kind of new to Florida. And so, you know, even during earlier eras when the experts were telling the state and the districts that we're pumping too much groundwater, I'm talking the early 2000s when Jeb Bush was governor, Jeb Bush didn't react with fire them. He reacted with, well, let's define the problem and fix it. Now, that's not what's going on since 2011 when our current governor took office. It's we're going to get rid of the people who tell us there's a problem and replace them with people who tell us there's no problem.
I wanted to go check out a district meeting, so I set off to one, where I communicated my concerns to the board. They heard me out at the podium, agreed with everything I was saying, and then assured me that their scientists are the best. These scientists play a critical role. They're in charge of assessing data and providing conclusions to the board, often based on data from the U.S. Geological Survey, an extremely well-respected and peer-reviewed survey of water monitoring. Board members then determine how much water can be used by various sources, whether approving new water permits or extending existing permits. And interestingly enough, water is a good that costs money to pump, but is completely free to be used by any approved applicant. In this way, the water management districts act like brokers of a bank, with water being the capital they manage. Their job then is to maintain the balance between outflows and inflows so that we don't withdraw more than is being deposited, which is unsustainable and could lead to bankruptcy and the collapse of a system, something that we have already seen happen, like at White Springs. One of the ways that water management districts do this is by setting up MFLs.
MFL stands for minimum flows and levels, and part of Florida statute requires the water management districts to set either a minimum flow or a minimum level, or it can actually be both, a minimum flow and level for lakes, springs, rivers, and also to some extent this can be used to set a minimum level for the aquifer.
Water for nature, water for people, as the Suwannee River Water Management District website states.
One of the big problems is that the governing board members may not spend as much time challenging the science that is presented to them by staff from the Suwannee River or from any water management district.
I've been working on the science for decades, and all the evidence is pointing to the fact that the models, which are the most important foundation for what they do, are very imprecise, and that's been confirmed by very talented, knowledgeable hydrogeologists that I work with. And so I'm not the best person to judge the models, but I have an awful lot of experience reviewing the results from the models and comparing those results to actual data. And in every case where I've done those comparisons, and it's quite a few of the springs now, the real data show very different results than the models do. So I'm convinced that the models are greatly underestimating the impacts of the human impacts on spring flows.
Water issues are extremely complex, and so the individuals who are in charge are not managing our systems properly intentionally, but it requires a great deal of evaluation and more importantly, the skill to weigh different types of evidence and evaluate evidence, and to have in place staff who can develop sort of unbiased studies that so everybody is clear what the problem is and provide really sound solutions to the problems.
They say they're the best available tools. So the law actually says that they can do these minimum flows and levels just using the best available tools. So as long as the districts don't prepare better models, then we're stuck with the existing models. And it's really ironic at Silver Springs in establishing this minimum flow and level recently. 3 years ago, they had a draft of the minimum flow and level. At that time, their model they were using concluded that there was no more water at Silver Springs, that Silver Springs was indeed past the point of harm and was already in recovery. They needed to reduce the amount of pumping. They got a new model that says, oh, well, turns out we do have some extra water in the aquifer. And that smells like political science to me rather than real science, where you just change your model to get the result that you want. Yes, if we continue increasing the amount of water we're pumping out of the aquifer, then ultimately more and more springs will stop flowing. All the springs have lost flow. We've done an inventory of all the springs that have data, and just about every spring in the state actually has declining flows, unless they are pirating flow from another spring that is drying up, and that we've seen that in a few cases. But no, all the springs together have lost over about a third of their historic flow, and that has been increasing every decade. That reduction in flow has been increasing every decade since we started keeping records in the 1920s and 30s.
And once you go below that minimum level, you do a couple of things. You stop issuing permits, so you're not withdrawing any more water. And the other, you start implementing plans to recharge the aquifer so the aquifer levels return to the minimum level.
So if members of the Water Management District Board are appointed by the administration, one may ask, what is their agenda? Today in 2017, we can look back on what has happened since Governor Scott has taken office in 2011.
Florida residents, as well as environmental and labor activists, are extremely concerned about the long-term damage the Sable Trail pipeline could have on the quality and safety of the state's drinking water. And critics are concerned the construction could damage the fragile limestone which surrounds the Florida aquifer. That supplies 60% of Florida's drinking water. If solar, for example, became a prime energy source in the state, maybe the construction of oil and gas pipelines wouldn't even be necessary.
Empty waterways and beaches. Tonight, toxic algae is keeping people out of popular South Florida hotspots. This problem starting after polluted water was dumped out of Lake Okeechobee to prevent flooding.
Well, this massive sinkhole opened up in Polk County 3 weeks ago, and since then, potentially radioactive water has been pouring into the Florida aquifer. But the public was never told until now.
A lot of neighbors are worried.
It's very upsetting, especially when you have 3 children.
I think it's ridiculous. How long has this been seeping into the ground or the wells or anything like that? I mean, it's scary.
If these events aren't exemplary enough, simply look at famed Florida photographer John Moran's before and after photos. Florida's leadership once saw the problems we needed to fix, but is currently doing the opposite, increasing the rate at which we bring about the demise of our ecological systems, moving backwards in time. But what about Florida residents? Where is the public outrage?
One of the problems with groundwater is it really is one of those that brings out the problems humans have in terms of our cognitive biases. We are not good at responding to things that are invisible. We are not good to responding to things that are sort of slow creeping problems, okay? So this is something that happens slowly. It's not as if, oh, all of a sudden there's a very visible algae bloom that's covering something I care about. So, you know, we slowly sort of accept the degradation of the environment. And when we drink water, it's not as if we're tasting the higher loads of whatever it is right away, and we're not testing our water all the time, and it doesn't have that visceral, scary reaction the way we react to other sorts of risks.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's something that I've been researching for the past couple years, you know, what causes this disconnect, and it's really fascinating because in Florida our water is very unique in that it's underneath our feet. And I think that for people, just because they can't see it, they automatically just assume that, you know, they're not having an impact on it or just don't understand that it's there. And so the good thing about that is that, you know, if people don't realize it's under their feet, once you help them realize it and how they impact it, I think that people are really willing to make changes in their lives, in their daily lives, and how they use water and kind of rethink how they use this, you know, basically our most vital resource. And then they can, you know, help improve our situation with water in Florida. But because they don't see it every day, they don't realize, you know, how they're harming what's just beneath their feet. So I think that for us as communicators, there's this really amazing opportunity there for us to kind of help show people what lies just out of sight and why that matters.
While cities across the state have had instances of civil disobedience, it hasn't been enough. When we look at the statistics, we find out why. 7 out of 10 Floridians are from out of state. That is, the massive majority of us moved here from somewhere else to vacation land. Though it may be our home now, we don't have ancestral or necessarily strong ties to our communities. In fact, Florida as a state has the worst civic engagement in the United States of America. Basically, we're not engaged. Our state's bountiful natural resources are being churned into $1 in any way they can be. And we, the people, are all just letting it happen.
It's incredible how many people in our state aren't aware of our current state with our water and the remainder of our resources, and how much water is being used and how much water is mindlessly being consumed. I know that if more people knew, if they were even faced with that problem, then they would want to change it.
A famous economist, environmental economist, her name is Graciela Cicciolinsky, but she wrote a paper where she mathematically showed it, but it's called the water diamond paradox, that at some point water should come out more valuable than diamonds because it's got an actually inherent use, whereas diamonds, okay, it's got some limited industrial uses, but you know, in many ways we have it backwards. And that's sort of exemplary of how our culture assigns style and value to things. And I think it's changing those norms to understand how critical water is. And that's going to be at the heart of what needs to be done.
So we have an ethic and a philosophy that the consumption of resources is the foundations of our entire economy. And in fact, it really is today. And so there is an ethic, a philosophy, if you will, that we need to start moving back from that extractive type of resource depletion, because so many of these resources are finite. We need to start moving into that ethic that everything we do needs to be viewed from the perspective of sustainability, and we can do that.
No, it could change almost overnight. It may. We may be at some threshold of awareness where this becomes a really big issue in the next election. Florida elects a governor who really plans to take on the issue of water and deal with it in a thorough way.
The biggest thing that we can do to reverse some of the damage that has already been done is to educate ourselves, educate others, and vote somebody into office that is mindful of our natural resources and our water. Without that, we're not going to see much change. But that is no reason not to continue pushing forward when it seems challenging and when it seems daunting, because it's something that we need to do. And if we join together as the public, we will be heard. It has been proven time and time again. And we just have to continue pushing. There is no other way to do it.
There is a sustainable future for Florida if we become more conservative in our use of our natural resources.
What Florida needs, and our whole society could benefit from, is a new outlook. A new ethic on how we view our environment, and specifically water. After air, water is the most crucial life source we as humans rely on. It makes up 60% of our body, and we can't live longer than 3 days without it. Water is also the source of all life on Earth. 3.8 billion years ago, no life would have been created here if water did not exist in its liquidy form. Water is so vital to creating life as we understand it that, in fact, when NASA explores the vastness of outer space in search of life, they look for one thing: presence of water. And though our planet is 70% water, only 3% of that is fresh, with just 1/3 of all fresh water on Earth being accessible to us and not locked up in glaciers. And now, in the 21st century, though it may not be on our global radar, we are on the brink of a water crisis. From California water bodies drying up to droughts sparking international civil wars like what is going on in Syria and the Middle East, scarcity of water is very real and not something to be taken lightly. This is happening in a time where land that sits on top of vast quantities of water is being bought up by corporations like Nestle, whose executive believes that water itself is not a basic human right. And if we take a moment to look outside ourselves, we can see that it is not just us who relies on water, but all of the creatures we share this earth with. When we take ventures into the outdoors, it is often the lives of other creatures that inspire us the most. What will be left to inspire future generations if we can't view the natural creatures of ecosystems we visit? There must be a better way that we, as a global society, can view water. No matter what you believe in life, water connects everyone, and could arguably be the source of religions across the world. Now that we've explored the importance of water, the current situation in Florida, and a glimpse of what is happening internationally, we can see that no matter what we believe in life, water connects all of us and is the ultimate source that life, as we know it, depends upon. May this realization lead us to make better decisions as individuals, communities, states, nations, and society as a whole. For when light has been shone upon an issue, we have a choice: to remain in the darkness where we feel hopeless, apathetic, and refrain from taking part in the answer, or to go into the light and follow what we know to be true.
Circles and give it meaning. Then give me something worth repeating. Or maybe this is the best that I'll get. This is the best that I get. And who will I be when I grow up? And how will I know if I've shown up?